Excited to be here again. I love this user group and of course all the fabulous people. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you. So I'm working remotely from Bend, Oregon today. So it's remotely always seems to be redundant at this point, but for me it is remotely because I don't have my usual setup. But thanks again for having me. I'm Shari Oswald. They call me Shortcut Shari. It was a joke at first, but it stuck and I love it. And so I love keyboard shortcuts. If you want to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook, I have a YouTube channel, and I'll put some of those in the chat after my presentation so you can connect with me in there. So today we're going to be talking about Microsoft Lists. And, oh, sorry, a couple of things. My method or my philosophy is to create passionate, energetic, and creative learning opportunities so that we can solve your business problems with technology. So if you have any interest in talking about some of your pain in your day, let me know. I love productivity. I'm passionate about it, and I want to help you get more efficient in your job. And I'm also an author on LinkedIn Learning. I have 3 courses at this point, and they're all about SharePoint. And so if you're interested in looking at those, there I'll put also that link in the chat for you so you can get a free, I think it's 30 days, 30 or 60 days on LinkedIn Learning. And you can watch not only my content, but other people's content as well. All right, so why do we need lists? Microsoft Lists is the tool of choice for tracking content. And I'd love to know if you would put in the chat for me, what are some of the things that you use lists for? Not Microsoft Lists, but just lists in general. So Excel, if you are tracking things like in an Excel spreadsheet, what are those things that you track? I'll give you a second. Go and put those in the chat for me. Not seeing any chats. You guys, do we not track things?
No, there's a few things on there. Not sure if you see it, but we've got the ye old grocery list. We've got the work tracker list, projects, assets, inventory, my honeydews, my favorite.
I like that. That's great.
Oh, IT hardware purchases. That's great. Budget.
Right. Users per system. I like that. All right. So again, these Excel, that's where we start. Microsoft Excel was originally information and do financial calculations for you. What happened is that it evolved into a data management tool instead, as in addition, not instead. And people are using that as kind of the one size fits all. But what they don't understand is that Microsoft Excel does great for tracking and maybe doing calculations. But sometimes we need a little bit more out of it. And so I'm going to put in the chat, I'm going to put in a link. And I'd like you to go out to forms. I'm queuing this up for later. So at some point while I'm speaking, I'd love for you to fill that out. It's an example of what Microsoft Lists can do for you. And I've pre-built it out, and we're going to kind of talk how you might want to build something like that out. All right. So the tracking tasks. Yes,
Shari, just so you know, we're still seeing your teams.
Yeah, I only have one device, so
gotcha.
I'm having to share the screen. So I'm just like, thank you so much.
No problem.
Yeah, the challenges of not having all your gadgets when you're at home, right? I'm having to present from one screen. That's what I was like, okay, I can look at my own slide or I can look at the chat. So, okay, great. So Luke has PTO holidays on call. Need a better calendar display list. Yeah. So SharePoint. The funny thing about lists is we'll kind of give you the best kept secret of lists here in a second. All right. So why do we need lists? We need this stuff to track information. So from what you all are sharing with me, you track a lot of different types of things, and it depends on your job. So that's a good lawyerly answer of it depends. What do you track and why do we need lists? So what is a Microsoft list? A few years ago, Microsoft decided that they're going to do a big hoorah and announce this whole new product, and they gave it a new icon and branding, and they put it in the apps in Office 365, and woohoo, we're going to call this Microsoft List. Well, guess what? It's SharePoint. This has been around for 20 years. For 20 years, I have been a Microsoft SharePoint aficionado. I use it constantly. It's my baby. They've been calling my baby ugly for 20 years, and it wasn't ugly. It's just the way you deployed it was ugly. So being able to use lists to track information is huge. Let me give you an example. I had a woman that I was working with, and it's a nonprofit organization that feeds children in underprivileged countries. And each country and each one of their partner it's a Christian-based organization. So each one of their partner churches had different ways of tracking the kids that they supported in their community and in their area. This could be something that maybe somebody built an Access database that was specific for that. Some of them are just tracking them in an Excel spreadsheet. Some of them are so remote and so primitive. It is a whiteboard or a chalkboard that's on the wall. And, in some of these countries, they have a high death rate. And so when a child passes away, they just erase their name. And there's no tracing of, the path that child took, because they're on the chalkboard, then they're not on the chalkboard. So this organization decided, we need to figure out how all of these kids are being tracked, because we want to be able to track their survivability. How have they thrived based on what we've been able to provide for them? And so they decided to go out to all of these organizations and find out, how are you tracking your kids? What tool are you using? And we came up, the woman that was supposed to put this together, create an Excel spreadsheet with all of the columns that she wanted them to fill out, emailed it out to like 60 some organizations, and they all sent it back different. They added new columns, they removed some of her columns, they reordered the columns, and now she has to go back and smush together 60 different versions of this spreadsheet that she sent out, because people had altered it for their own use. I'm like, Denise, why wasn't this a SharePoint list? They all have access to SharePoint. She goes, I don't know, Shari, just help me fix it, right? She spent 3 weeks of her time trying to figure out how to put that all back together, when she should have just created a SharePoint list so they could all collaborate in the same place at the same time with the same information. And that was back when it was SharePoint. So what types of content can you store in a list? We have single lines of text, which is, if you're a data person, so SharePoint lists and the capability within Power Automate and Power BI were not a big jump for me, because I'm an Access guru. And the data types, I think, are the hardest thing for people to kind of wrap their head around. And we have the ability to create different types of data, so you can create calculations based on those columns. You can pull like the first name and last name out of a string, or you can pull the month out of a date. So creating your columns in your SharePoint list, everybody likes just to create a list that's all text. Well, great. Well, you've just lost a lot of capability, because what if you put in a date and then you're like, well, the due date is going to be 60 days from that date. Putting it in as text is, you've just taken away the ability to automate a lot of things. So when you're creating your lists in your Excel spreadsheet, think about the column types that you have in there and how they're formatted. Are they formatted as text? Are they formatted as a date? We don't have a lot of other choices beyond that in Excel. In SharePoint, you have a lot of different options. So you've got single lines of text, multiple lines of text. So the difference between those is single lines of text are 255 characters or less. Multiple lines of text have up to I think it's 46,538 or something like that characters that you can put in those. So that's kind of like the memo field or the comments field. Numbers, which again, those let you calculate. Location is fairly new, and I think it came out right before Microsoft List came out, if I remember correctly. Lets you actually create a map or coordinates of a specific location. You have a date and time, so it can be a date or a time or a date and time. If you're not familiar with that particular data type, I call it the star date. Every day since January 1st, 1900 has been assigned a sequential number. And that number is, when they say star date, 40,000 or 4,682, if you were to change that format, put that number in an Excel spreadsheet and change it to a date, it would tell you what the star date is. And the decimal of that date is the time. So, 40,658.5 would be noon that day. So think of it that way. This allows you to do some of those calculations. I worked with the Mayo Clinic at one point. When I showed them that, they're like, well, how many decimals can you have? Because they're measuring their research in nanoseconds. I'm like, I don't know. That's a really good question. So having the ability to convert that date and time into something something you can calculate is huge. You have yes and no fields. This is not just yes and no, black and white. These are basically a checkbox. Is it true or is it false? And when they call it a yes/no field, to me, that is a little misleading. And in the technical term, it's a Boolean or Boolean field, however you want to pronounce it. So that either records a true or false, or in the case of a numerical value, a false is 0 and a true is either 1 or -1, depending on which format you're using. All right. Person or group, this is the magic of SharePoint lists, because you can access the people that are in your Active Directory, in your address book, and it allows you to create really cool views like the Me view. What are the things that I've created? What are the things?
Hey, Shari, I think we might have lost audio.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe she got muted.
I did not mute myself. So
okay, everybody,
okay.
Get your
All right,
finger
guys.
off the trigger.
Please stop muting people.
Not nice.
Cool. All right. So where did you last hear me?
Let's see. I think you were at person or group and bringing people in from your Active Directory.
Okay, perfect. So the person or group, bringing people in from Active Directory, allows you to create very dynamic views like the Me view. So you can filter on what are the things that I created, what are the things that I modified, or what are the things that are assigned to me. Each person that logs in sees a dynamic view. So that's a really important type of field to use or column when you're creating your SharePoint lists, which are Microsoft lists. The hyperlink, which lets you link to somewhere else. It could be a link to a website. It could be a link to an email. It could be a link to an asset that you have somewhere in your 365 or other environments. You have a choice field, which lets them choose from a selected list of items. And you can also let them add their own values in there. We're going to kind of walk through each of these, but I wanted you to kind of get an overview of what types of information you can store in a list. Images are things like if you have a link to an image, like a person's picture. And then finally, currency. The currency is really an important one to highlight, because you can have a field that's a number field and create a calculation on it. However, if you're creating calculations on that and it's actually money, you can end up with penny rounding errors because the number of decimals that it recognizes is different. So if you are working with money, you always, always, always want to use the currency field, because if you, again, calculations will be skewed. All right, so if you know me at all, you know I'm not a PowerPoint person. I like to give a little bit of visuals, but really where the magic happens is the demo. All right, so I have my demo environment here. When you are working in Office 365 from the waffle, if you expand the waffle, you will see all of the applications that are available to you. And the ones that you use most, or the ones that you pinned, are going to show up first. And then you click all apps to see all of them, and they'll be in alphabetical order. So I say that as a disclaimer because my demo environment has absolutely everything installed. And therefore, you may see things in my environment that you don't see in yours because your organization may not have released those for you yet. I like this view of the apps because not only does it show you all of the tools that you have in the toolbox available to you, but you can hover over and get an idea of what that tool does. You see a weird name like Sway. What is that? Hover over it and it gives you an explanation of what that tool does. So in here we have lists, which again, they rebranded, called it Microsoft Lists, but guess what? It's really SharePoint, and it has been SharePoint for 20 years. All right, so Microsoft Lists, when you create a list, I want to point out here at the top, you're going to get this lovely little introduction if it's the first time that you've been there. Always read these because it gives you an idea. And when Microsoft does upgrades or updates, like Don shared with us at the beginning, this is how they let you know what's new and cool since the last one you were here. People tend to close the pop-ups. Definitely read them. Under Microsoft Lists, I want to point out in the URL right now, it says mysharepoint.com/personal. This should be a huge red flag to you if you're creating a list that's going to manage a process beyond your, what I call your shelf life. If you win the lottery and run away, will this process be affected if you store this in your personal lists? Yes. So when you create a list from Microsoft Lists, you're going to create something that either has been transferred to somebody later or is going to be lost, or that process is going to be broken. So when you create one from Microsoft Lists, always make sure that it's for you only and not for somebody else's, your successor, should you again win the lottery and run away or move up in the company and change jobs. You want to make sure that the people have that. You can share lists with other people, but just as a fail-safe, always make sure you're creating your list in the right place. Microsoft Teams, if I go out to Microsoft Teams, lists can be created in groups and your Office 365 groups, which of course is the foundation of Microsoft Teams. So if I go out to Teams instead, let's say I want to create a list that's going to track, like some of you were mentioning, we have asset trackers, or we have, maybe we have content and we're in marketing. We want to track our content that we're going to be creating for our blog or for our campaigns, things like that. Instead of creating that list in your lists, you can create it in the team itself. And that gives the whole team the same ability that you do. So they have the same permissions that you have. So if I were to go to the sales and marketing team and decide I want to create a list, I'm going to add, oops, not that plus sign. Go away. Back here. Nope. You can see I've been busy building stuff for y'all. All right, let me go back to Teams. Let's do it from here. All right, so the sales and marketing team, and I'm going to go to the general channel, and let's create a new channel because we have a new focus of our work. Let's create a channel called campaigns. So when I create Microsoft Teams, I use the formula of the who, what, and how. The team is who needs to work together. The channels are what are they working on or what are they having conversations about. And the how are they going to get that work done is the tabs across the top. Let's bring those tools from the toolbox into one place where they can all work together and not have to go from tool to tool within Office 365. So our lists are going to be here. And you have a standard set of lists that are available to you. So I'm going to create a new list. Here are the templates that Microsoft has created, and there's more here. There used to only be 8, and they've changed the icon. So if this looks a little bit different, I am in the most updated. You may have a little cartoon-looking screenshot of the different options that are there. So they've got some patients, incidents, and loans. Those are the 3 that jump out at me that are new that I haven't seen before. So you may have to check those, kind of look and see what's available. If your company or your organization has created some standard templates, you're going to see some in the From Your Organization link at the top. So we can, these might help us track. So we have an issue tracker, we have an employee onboarding tracker, an event itinerary. So if you're planning the user group or you're doing a conference, that might be something that would be helpful to have, a starting point at least. I'm going to use the content scheduler. And the content scheduler is tracks the title, the topic, who's presenting, you know, what status it's at. So starting with this template might be something that's helpful. And I'm having my daughter actually help me with a lot of my social media. And this is how we track everything. We have the content scheduler. All right, so these are campaign. Let's say these, we're going to change the name. Campaign tracker. Always add the description. Everything in Office 365 or Microsoft 365 is searchable. It's our job to make it findable. Campaign tracker, have you ever searched for something, even on the internet, you go out and do an internet search and you're using the wrong terminology and you're like, oh man, I didn't even, I'm searching for whatchamajig and I should have been searching for thingamabob to get the right results. The same thing here, the description is your opportunity to add different terminology for people to search for. So this could be, where we plan the blog posts. So if maybe they're looking for blog schedule, right? Blog posts and campaign content. And helps if you can spell. For social media. So now I've just given them 3 new terms to search for in my description. And this might come up if they have permission to see it, of course. All right, I'm going to click create. And we now have a starting point. This is, I can say I have never, ever used a template that has met every need that I had. I have other things that I want to track. So if we have, here's our description, our author, our status, the draft due by, published by, content type. Now this is being presented in Microsoft Teams, but it actually lives in SharePoint. And I think they finally did, under the little more options button, now say open in SharePoint. I used to have to go into the files and hit the go to SharePoint site to get the backdoor into the list. So finally they added that link. Thank you so much. And it takes me over to the SharePoint site that sits behind the sales and marketing team. We have, now we have our content, title, description. Maybe I have channels that we use that we post our content in. So where do I track that? I can either repurpose one of the columns that are there, or you can add the column here. So this is where those data types come into play. There are a few more at the bottom that you can use that I didn't add to the list, like manage metadata, because that's beyond the scope of this, lookup. But then we have the more option. And if you're a SharePoint person, when you click more, this should look very familiar to you. This is the back end of the SharePoint list. This is the ugly baby, as I used to call it. But this is where a lot of functionality occurs that is not available in lists yet. Unless you know how to peek behind the curtain and really make it work for you, you're missing out on a lot of capability within there, because creating like a calculation, a calculated value, isn't one of the options from the list side. The magic happens in SharePoint. So if I have let's say I want to say channels. What are the channels that we want to publish on? I'm going to make this a choice field. Now, each one of your data types, as you're looking at them, if I select single line of text, you scroll down, they all have a description. Again, the description makes it findable, but in the case of a list, this is where you add the instructions or the prompts of what you're expecting them to answer there, because it shows up on the form when they fill it out. How do we make sure that they're giving us the right information? Okay. So we give them a description, so it gives them a little more instructions, because I don't know about you, but not everybody gives instructions like I do, and I don't interpret they don't interpret mine the same way I do either, so I'm not saying I'm always right. All right, so require that this content column contains information. You can make it required. When I'm, hopefully some of you have filled out that travel request form that I sent out, because we all want to get back to traveling. That's at the list level. If I'm going to create a form that feeds a SharePoint list, then I am going to not make everything required, because there was some branching in that form that you saw. If I make the rental car required, guess what? I have just blocked them from being able to fill out this form because in the back end, if I make them required, then it won't be able to submit. So I leave it pretty open on this side. I rarely ever hit the requirement here because on the form itself, I can designate that it's required. If you're wanting to fill them out from the list level, then you're going to want to make things required that you need to be required. All right, maximum number of characters. Now, if you're a database person at all, you understand the field sizes and the field types. And let me give you kind of the layman's term on that. When you create a field and it gives you the ability to hold a maximum of 255 characters, it reserves the space in the database behind the scenes that in order for you to ever fill out that many characters. Unfortunately, that also bogs down your search engines because it has to search through and index 255 characters, even if the max you ever have is 20 or 5. So if it's like a product code and it's only over 10 characters, right size these fields because it will cause you problems, right? In your searchability is going to bog down the indexing and searching and the processing of things. So if this is the longest, if I'm going to put in the channel and I just want them to type in the channel, I'm going to give them maybe 20 characters to type that in. Okay. So always fill out descriptions. So in this one, I'm going to make this a choice eventually. So I'm going to put in please select the channels where this item or where this content will be provided. I'm giving them instructions, right? The multiple lines of text will change the options that you have below. Required is always there, but now I have different choices that are available based on a multiple lines of text field. So I have 6 lines for editing, plain text, or in this case, I have an enhanced rich text, which lets you add tables and pictures and make things bold. So if you don't need all of that, again, that takes up more space in your database. Switch it back to plain text because it's just a comment field. You don't want them to add pictures, things like that. Just depends on what you need. And then this is an interesting little setting. Append changes to existing text. Instead of overwriting what was there before, when people alter or change it, it just adds to it. So you have kind of a running history of what the evolution of that content of that field was or column. Choice fields let you select or give them the choices that you want them to be able to select from. You can display them in a drop-down menu, which lets them choose one, a radio button, which lets you choose one, and extra points for those of you that know why that's called a radio button. I'll share with you in just a second if you want to, but I'll give you a chance to answer. Why are those called a radio button? Or checkboxes allow them to select multiple items, so you can let them choose from multiple selections. Do you want them to allow fill-in choices? What this means is that if you don't give them the choice that they want to select, you have standard answers, but you want them to be able to write in other things. Sometimes you don't because you have a process, and when you start applying Power Automate and tying these tools together, that depends on what is selected in this column. So you may or may not want to allow them to put in fill-in choices. And then what is the default value? If I were to put in here, my channels are going to be, let's say it's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, right? Those are my choices. After you select that, it's going to pick the very first one. So you can decide what you want that one to be. Okay, has to be one of the choices. If you try and type something in there like no preference or all, then that needs to be a choice in the list. Here are your number fields. So again, these are calculated. When you think of numbers, it's not a social security number or an account number or a phone number. Those are text. Numbers are meant to be calculated. So if you're going to use the numbers, you'll have the different options for the number fields, minimum and maximum. One thing I always get a question on is this enforce unique values. And what that means is that that value cannot occur again in the list in that column. So social security number, an account number, if you want unique entries and people can't duplicate those, that would be a good choice for you. But if you put that like on a last name field, that's a bad idea because you can never have more than one Smith or Jones. Excuse me one second. Get some to drink here. All right. When you have a number field, you can specify the range, minimum or maximum, the number of decimals you want it to recognize, and then you can make it be a calculated value. So the default value, either a number or it can be a calculation of the other fields that are there and show as a percentage. Now this column formatting has to do with JSON, and there's some columns, I'll show you where in a list it's easier to do this because you don't want to have to type that out, let me tell you. All right, currency. Again, here's the money part. If it's money, use currency. Always, always, always. You have some of the same choices that you have, except you also have the, for numbers, but you also have the choice of which type of currency you want to track there. Date and time. These are the where we're going to track either dates, time, or date and time. You have date only or date and time. The default value can be today's date. So what date was this request submitted? You can have it automatically default to today's date so that people don't have to fill that in and make it a little user-proof. Lookup is one of my favorites. If you have other lists or libraries within your SharePoint environment, which is, of course, the back end of your Teams, you can go into another list and look up value. So if I had the channels in its own list, or maybe I have it in some of your case, like you said, you have assets. Assets is in one list and who they're assigned to is in another list. Then you can go and look up the asset number and have it pull information over from that other list. When you do that, any of the other columns, so right now it's looking in the, it can actually look up to itself as well. But if I want to pull something from the product list, then the columns that are in the product list would be displayed here. And you're like, what do you want me to bring over to? So this is almost like a join query. If you think like Access or database SQL queries, it's kind of like a join query. It kind of brings that information over into your list as well. Here's the yes, no, that checkbox. So it's not just yes or no. The only option here is the default value is either yes or no, person or group. This one is big because, again, this is where you create those dynamic me views. And how do you want that person to be displayed or that group to be displayed? You can display all of these different attributes that it pulls from the Active Directory. The caveat here is it has to be populated in Active Directory. If they haven't put the job title or the department or the supervisor's name or whatever in Active Directory, not going to do any good if they haven't populated it over there. All right. You can also have it people only or people and groups. Maybe this is assigned to a specific group instead of just a person. You can choose from groups as well. Do you want them to allow multiple values? And if you do a SharePoint group, you can actually create, here are the 3 group memberships that are within this SharePoint site that it creates by default. If you have additional ones, they would be displayed there too. All right, hyperlink or picture. It's basically how do you want it to be formatted, a hyperlink or as a picture. Calculated, this is one of my favorites. Again, this is where it adds the ability to do calculation. So if I put draft is due by, I can pick the columns and then do +3. It will calculate the what is the due date based on the draft due. And so the draft is due by, let's say tomorrow. 3 days later is when it needs to be approved. So you can use any of the calculations, and if you want to use the formula calculations that are in Excel, most of those come over. The big thing you need to understand, the formulas and functions that are in Excel can be used in a SharePoint list or Microsoft list column as a calculation. The big differences are if in Excel have to be if in here, And the field names or the columns have to be in square brackets, not the squiggly ones and not the parentheses. They have to be the square brackets. But when you click on it, it'll give you a list of all the current fields that you can calculate on, and then give that to you as an option. So you can kind of use it as a little formula builder, or you can type it out. And then how do you want that result to be displayed? Do I want this to be, right now it's going to do the calculation, but the resulting column is going to be in text, which means I can't do another calculation on that one. If I want to be able to calculate, I need to make it be another date. Okay. Image, these other ones I'm not going to get into. So I'm going to pop back over to Teams real quick and see if you have any questions.
See, I don't see any questions, but if anyone has any, go ahead and throw that in the meeting chat. I know we have been hearing a high-pitched noise, and it could be your audio. We're not quite sure, but we have been debating whether it was a tea kettle or you're near an airport. It's not. I think it's not. That's
there's
it's
nothing,
not that
there's
strong.
A lot of road noise here, but I don't have the tea kettle. Subtle is what you're saying?
Yeah, it's real subtle,
okay.
For sure. Yep.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that. I know, because that would annoy me. Okay. We have, all right, so let's go back to the list then, if you don't have any questions. Or what's your favorite thing? Are you like, oh, I'm totally going to use this? Anybody feel like I'm totally going to use this for something new? Would love to know what that is in the chat as well. So creating your columns allows you to customize what content you want to share. So let's pick apart that travel request that I shared with you in the when I asked you to fill it out in the link. So I'm going to go out to my lists.
Hey, there's one question or comment, Shari, before you dive in again.
Sure. Thanks.
That someone, Vicky has had issues with list tabs not consistently opening within the Teams UI. Wondered if anybody else, and maybe that's just for people inside of the chat. Have you seen that at all, Shari?
My only question would be, did they create it in their personal and now they're trying to put it into a Teams tab? That I have not seen that myself, but would be happy to have anyone else chime in if that's been their experience, or you being the Teams guru, if you have an answer.
No, I think that would be right. If you try to put it in a team, obviously your team is backed by SharePoint. So if you have a personal list, that's just going to be an authentication error for any other members who you have not shared it with, will not be able to see it.
Right. It's going to be like, nope, denied. And that's, again, they gave us this great tool, but they didn't tell you, it's kind of like Planner. When you create a planner, it creates all this other stuff behind the scenes, right? And same thing with lists. You got to be careful where you create things.
And Vicky is saying, no, they created a tab within Teams. So I haven't seen that behavior, Vicky. I think that's interesting to maybe try to recreate or see if maybe it was a bug at the moment. But no, I haven't seen it. There's a couple other comments here. Adam's asking, for the list creation editing, do MS Teams owners inherit permissions to the SharePoint list as well? Or do we have to do that separately?
No, when you create it from Microsoft Teams, it automatically inherits the permissions of that team. However, if you go into the site contents, this is, again, you can't do in lists. You can't do this from lists because you can't change permissions from the Teams interface and from lists, but you can from here. Under your, so here's my campaign tracker that I just created. Under the settings, you can change the permissions on there. So there's several different list settings that I think are important to know about. The first one is the item level. So under the advanced settings, who can read and who can edit and who can delete things. And so this, create and edit access, create and edit items that were created by the user. So this locks it down. So I can't go in and change what Michelle added. And I can't go in and change what Dawn added. I can only create and edit the things that I added. and because otherwise everybody has the exact same permissions. So this is an important setting in there. The other one is the versioning. If you want to keep track of what's been changed, because again, everybody has the same permission, you can create your versioning settings here. First of all, there's content approval, and somebody can submit something, but other people can't see it until it's been approved. Who can see the versions as the items have been changed, if you want to be able to see the version history, and who can see the items that are in draft mode, the things that have not been approved. So there's 2 different key settings in that list that you need to be aware of. Definitely go into these and set your permissions as well. Who can add things, who can delete things, who can approve things are all under the permissioning. So right now, everybody, it inherits the permissions from its parent. If you stop inheriting permission, then you can change. Right now, they all have contribute access, the exact same. And the sales and marketing owners have full control. The sales and marketing visitors can only do read. You can change at the person level or at the group level. I don't like having individual permissions in a list like this. That's just my best practice, has been for over 20 years. Permissions should be based on groups. That way you can add or remove people from a group and change their permission. Having to go in and individually manage each person and their permissions and everything is one of my frustrations with the way the Teams architecture was created as a SharePoint person. So I'll get off that soapbox. I won't even get on that soapbox, but that's one of.
But it's important to note though that the 3 groups that are there, you've got owners; those are going to be your team owners. Members are going to be everyone you added to the team, and visitors. There is no one in there because Teams doesn't allow for visitors out of the box. Now,
Right.
Obviously, you can see there is a group. So technically, you could put somebody in there. They could only then see that list, and they couldn't have edit access to it.
There's
but
all
that's
those exact same people in the members list. So why are they in there individually here? That's my peeve.
Yep. Yep.
They shouldn't have 2 levels. Yeah, for sure. Well, and if you ever wonder, if somebody comes in and says, well, I can't add this or I can't edit this, always go into the check permissions. You can put in their name. So if I want to see, Adele's having an issue, select Adele and then check, and it'll show you what permission she has from where. She has contribute given directly, which is this individual permission right here. Full control through the sales and marketing owners group, because she was one of the owners. Sales and marketing through the members group, she can edit, and then add and customize pages. She doesn't have that at all. So that's the first place when people tell me they're having problems with the content. This is the first place I go. And again, this is not in Teams. You can't access this from Teams. You have to go into SharePoint and peek behind the curtain. All right. So under my lists, we had that travel request list. So how did I create that? I went in and I took the travel request, the travel tracker template, and added other fields to it. So I have like the Bougie Airways, Cheapo, those ones. We have the, which rental car do you want to use? And when you're in this view, let's say I want to be able to, I'm going to edit this column settings, format this column. This is where you make it pretty. All the choices, so we have choice pills, which is the formatting. This is the ugliness that you would have had to have typed in that column behind the scenes. This is no fun. I don't want to do that. I don't know about you. Some people really love doing that. You can change the format of the choices or the items that you have. Now, because of the way that I created this one, because it's a ranking, it's not a real good example of creating the pills. But if I add another column, I'm just going to show or hide some of the other columns that are back there, including, see, car preferences there. Oh, you guys didn't pick a car. Y'all skipped the car preference. All right. Under car preferences, format this column. Because I had branching in there that you're like, I'm just going to take the train. In certain cities, I do too. All right, let's do that again. Format this column. Then you can pick the colors. So these are going to be choice pills. And then each one of your values, you get to pick what color you want it to be. They changed this. Am I crazy? Format the view. Edit styles. Here we go. So what are each of the choices and what color do you want them to be? And you can pick the little color choice and let it pick different styles. So you get to choose. So there's Screen Machines and Hot Rods. They're both red. Maybe I want the Hot Rods to be purple instead. And as you add different values, I've seen where people change the choices in this view. It doesn't automatically assign them the color. So sometimes we need to come into the front end of Teams or front end of the list to make it look the way we want it to. So if I go into the back end of this one and look at my list settings, tab requests. Okay, now it's not letting me go back to SharePoint. That's in that same site that I created this one in, so I'll just go back here. And travel tracker. And list settings. So there's always 3 to 5 ways to get anywhere in Microsoft. Here are all the columns that I created. We've got the choice field, we've got the number field, and the location field. So this is a really important. I take a snapshot of this. Microsoft Teams and the lists that are there are what I call the bones of your process. You can create and track any information in there, but you can tie together the other tools in the toolbox to make them all work together. So I do not want everybody in the company coming into my SharePoint site and giving them access to add requests for travel. This is where we track these. I don't want those people poking around in here. So instead of creating giving them access to the list, I created the Microsoft form, which talks to the list. So you want to make note of which columns you have and what types of data they store. That's huge. You need to know what types of data they store. And then I replicated that using forms. I'm going to go and edit this request and show you. So, how did I do the sections where it lets you skip whether you wanted a rental car or hotel? I did it here. I have 23 responses from you fabulous peoples about, what type of travel that you're wanting to look at or that you're requesting. Under my questions, here's the purpose of the trip. Here, you see the little star? This is where I make it required. I don't make it required in the list. I make it required in the form. That way it doesn't lock up my list if they don't submit it correctly. There's a Power Automate behind the scenes that'll fail and they'll never see it. And I may never get their request for a trip because in the back end it failed. Okay, so here is the lodging requests, the air travel requirements, the air travel preference, all mapped to the column that's in the SharePoint list. So how did I get the two to talk to each other? We do that with Power Automate. So again, now we're using 3 tools. And if I go into my All Apps, scroll down to Power Automate, raise your hand if you've used these. I go into the templates and I search for what we have for forms. And here's one that says record form responses in SharePoint. If you're looking for record form, let me say that again. Record form responses in Microsoft Lists, you're not going to find it because Lists is the pretty front end that makes the baby pretty, but that's not where it actually stores it. It stores it in the back in SharePoint. So here's the record form responses. In SharePoint, this is a template that you can start from that lets you tie the two together. So that's exactly what I did. And I can't do that in an hour. But if I look at my flows, I actually chose the one because I added to a little nuance to it too. Create the a SharePoint item and a planner task on a form submission. And you map each one of the fields from one to the other. The big issue I have found for myself, because I'm just not a coder, so I'm telling you, I'm not a coder, and I did this, is when you have a multiple select and you post it from forms into a SharePoint list, you have to like deconstruct the multiple select and reconstruct it, and I haven't figured out how to do that. So all my forms are pretty simple. They get one choice. All right, so under here, the steps are when a new response is submitted, so you have to choose the form, get response details from which form, create a task, so this is the planner piece, so it created a task for me, and then create the item in the task. So here's where I said title, put in the title. Requester claim is the person that created it, so it's the user account. The reason, these are all fields that came from the form. So some of them come from the item and some of them come from the form. So pretty cool to be able to automate that. So lists, again, are the bones. It's where the content is tracked. You can create calculations. Let's say if I said they picked the luxury car, the estimated car price would be $500 or whatever. Or if I pick the luxury hotel, it's going to be $1,000 a night versus the Econo Lodge, whatever. So you can do some smart analysis using Automate. And also you can take it to a whole nother level if you want to use Power Apps, because then you can put in logic. The Microsoft Forms, other than branching, doesn't really provide you with logic. If maybe I want to say if they're a C-level person in the company, they can pick the luxury car and they can pick the luxury, but if they're the person, just the basic worker bee, they can't pick the luxury. That type of logic you can't do within a Microsoft form yet. I always say yet because Microsoft always has things up their sleeve. So, all right, so the travel planner, and then let's go and look and see what happened in Planner. So I just want to give you an idea of the magic that you can create behind the scenes. So here's my planner. As a group, this goes to my travel team, the corporate travel team, and here are all of your trips that I now need to plan, whether I approve them or not. If I go back to when I'm ready, I can book the airline, I can put the rental car, whatever phases I'm doing to track my travel. Cool? So lots of magic that can happen with lists. Now I want to give you all an offer. I've actually created a 1-hour course on how to do this, and I'm going to make it available to you as part of a free trial, and hopefully you'll be able to learn how to do this as well. Let me get I'm trying to get back there. I can't get my Teams bar over the top of where I can minimize and go back. Okay, you can't move the Teams bar, right? Oh, let's unpin it. Let's see if it goes away. Go away. There we go. Nope. I'm going to stop presenting. There, now I can get to it. And represent. All right, so if you have, I'd love to have any questions. I'd be able to answer those for you. But if you want to, go ahead, and if you go to this URL, bit.ly, I'll put it in the chat as well. Let me know if you want a free 30 days in our Power Bytes Learning Portal, which that course, I'm going to publish it this week. And when I get back from Ben's, and I'll have it up by Friday if you're interested in watching that course. It's all video training broken down into small manageable pieces, so whichever piece you need. All right, I will go ahead and hand it back over to Michelle. Thank you all for having me. Again, I'm Shortcut Shari. It's my job to make your job easier, and always a pleasure to be here with you. And wish I was in Minnesota with y'all, but maybe someday soon we'll come back.
Oh, that would be fantastic. This was a great session, and so I think so much great feedback, because it's such a wide array of solutions when you think about all the things that we are always trying to automate and not put in Excel anymore. And actually have it go to Planner, go to SharePoint, be tracked, have limited access. Just fantastic overview. Thank you so much, Shari.
My pleasure. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
All right, you too. All right, let's find out. And if there's any more questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. I'm sure Shari will stick around, or I'll send them over to her. Be sure to check out her video. With that, I'll ask is, Chris, are you ready to come on stage?
Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Awesome. Well, it's a pleasure to be back and speaking for the user group. I also am presenting remotely today, which is why I will not be on camera. And hopefully you don't hear any background noise. I'm here in the hotel lobby. It's just so if there's any issues with audio or video, please feel free to speak up.
You got it.
And with that, I will go ahead and share out my slide deck here. And at the end of this presentation, I'll actually be providing this to the user group because there's a lot of information in this. I will warn you now, this is definitely by the literal sense a guide because there's a lot of references in here
Awesome.
for best practices, implementation as we start to talk about security and management in the cloud. And to touch on one thing that Michael Bergering, one of our account execs, had mentioned in his presentation earlier, is kind of that whole story of streamlining and strengthening our security posture, our management posture, and that is really where this particular presentation is rooted. Is how do we take and approach security in the web as it is today, and bring all those resources into one single pane of glass. So that's just a little bit of background on this presentation, a little bit about me. I've been in Microsoft consulting for over 20 years, been with Concurrency for 7. I've got 3 kids, been married for over 20 years, love M365. When I'm not in front of the computer, I love music, love traveling for music, as well as food, which, if you were in my earlier presentation around Defender, I think it was late last year, you probably found out that I'm a foodie as well. My information, you can find my blog, memphistech.net, as well as on LinkedIn. So going back to that concept of it being a wild, wild web out there, as we can see, and we've all witnessed this in our organizations over the last couple of years, security is being attacked constantly, and even more so. And being able to have the right controls in place to be able to monitor securely, being able to look at sophistication, and being able to have the visibility into compliance without not spending a lot of money when it comes to tool sets, and being able to respond quickly is, we see that in a lot of our customers, that they have a multitude of different technologies in their stack. And some of you may relate to this picture in a lot of the different platforms that are used, from SaaS platforms to security tools to devices. This is the modern IT landscape. We're dealing with lots of different platforms, lots of different tools, lots of users that are working from anywhere and everywhere. So how do we respond quickly? How do we manage our resources quickly? And at the end of the day, our data centers are one of our core resources that we must protect at all costs, along with our data, along with our users. But all of that, usually when we start looking at the ransomware attacks, some of the large organizations that have been in the news, usually those all start at things like phishing emails, which is one of the biggest attack vectors and one of the actual most profitable attack vectors that we see in the security landscape of how bad actors are able to get into the environment. And with that, in looking at some of those tool sets, the complexity of integrating all those tool sets, being able to have logging, monitoring, and reporting, being able to be timely, and being able to do it with ease is very complex. And so as we look to do more, we talk to customers, we talk to organizations and challenge them. It's like, how can we do more with less, and how can we do better? IT budgets are shrinking, and tool sets and licensing doesn't get any cheaper as well. But then as we look at what are options, and as we start to dig into some of the technologies as part of today's presentation, looking at modern management in the cloud, a lot of it does sit in that Defender stack. And as you can see here, from being able to not only streamline protection for your end users, being able to streamline and manage those resources in your clouds, in your data centers, are also important and are able to be done with ease. Starting at that first click of an email that might be a phishing attack to one of your users, to phishing for identities, trying to deploy malicious tool sets onto endpoints, as well as being able to protect applications and clouds. This is really that security landscape. As we think about streamlining and strengthening, this is the picture that we take that step initially with our users, but now how can we extend that to our data centers with all the different tool sets that we might see? And we saw this in that initial slide of 40, 50 different tools that we'll commonly see from integration, not only for management, but also protection. Because at the end of the day, being able to have that visibility into our resources and protecting them is just as important as how we manage those as well. And one of the big reasons, is if you would have asked me, or if I would have told you 5 years ago, put all of your eggs in one basket with Microsoft, probably would have got some questionable responses. But in the last 5 years, with the advent of EMS and the Enterprise Mobility Suite, and Microsoft putting a lot of investment in billions of dollars in investment into their security tools, using themselves as their own backyard and eating their own dog food when it comes to security and management, we can see that Microsoft has taken some huge strides, not only in security, but also in management, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. But a lot of these tools in how we have visibility into the environment, how we're able to look at any sort of threats, look at best practices, a lot of it does sit at the core of what Microsoft has invested in, not only their cloud, but also in their AI as well. I'm not going to go too much in the weeds with regards to pricing, but this is an area too where when we sit down with customers and say, what are you paying for all of these different tool sets within your environment? This is a good example of what you see for your end users and why a lot of organizations have gone to E5. But being able to eliminate a lot of those tools does actually lead into reduction in costs as well. And as we look at some of those tool sets, as we start to then move from the end users, we start to move into the data centers, see where there's those potential opportunities for being able to streamline and strengthen. There's also the opportunity as well to save some cost as well, and be able to increase our security posture by having a number of different resources, such as if you have multiple clouds, if you have Google Cloud, if you have AWS, even outside of Azure, being able to have visibility into the security and the management of those tool sets in one pane of glass not only leads to a reduction in those soft costs that you see with being able to have your teams do more with less, but also those hard costs when it comes to licensing and tools and just the complexity of managing your data center environments as well. So this brings us to the question, why should we modernize? We already talked about some of the hard costs and soft costs, but being able to do more with less and have everything within a single pane of glass, whether it's in your data center or another data center within a single tool set, not only helps you from your security posture and compliance, but also being able to extend that to protecting your resources, your servers, threats, being able to automate at scale. Those are just a few of those soft costs that once you're using a single pane of glass in a single tool set, you're able to start to realize how you get better protection as well as improved automation with that one tool set. And today we'll be talking primarily about not only Defender for Cloud, but also how we utilize Azure Arc for a lot of those onboarding and automation tool sets. So, we'll look a little bit at how we implement some of those tool sets in the data center. And then towards the end of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about how do we operationalize that. Now that we have these tools, we have them in place, we're getting all this data, how do we as IT organizations take that next step to be able to utilize that data, and even at the end of the day, let AI do some of that work for us so that way we can better focus our time at other things within our IT departments and then take those alerts as they come in and be able to take action against them. As I mentioned before, being able to have one tool set means that you get to take advantage of a single pane of glass across your security environment. Being able to clearly look at metrics from your storage to your SQL to your servers to looking at policies, having everything in one spot has its benefits. Being able to, again, that streamline and strengthen story. We also see that by way of not having to spend as much time into moving between different vendor platforms, moving between different tool sets. And that in itself, being able to train your IT department for managing one tool set and being able to find FTEs or even third parties to help you manage that tool set becomes easier too, because you have that one single experience. Being able to take that a step further. I know we all heard about the Microsoft Secure Score and how it looks at metrics and being able to look at all of your resources. I know we're familiar with Defender for Endpoint and Secure Score. This takes that same concept into your data center and it's constantly evaluating how your data is being accessed through identities, how your compute is being managed, SQL network applications as well, being able to have those security scores at your fingertips, again, is another benefit of consolidating all your tool sets into one source, plus being able to look at your inventory. I can then now look at my servers, whether they're in Azure, whether they're on-prem. I can look at my storage. I can see my entire cloud footprint in one place, easily be able to filter down and look at the health of those resources, and then be able to take that data and move it into other platforms or use that data within our IT departments to determine what budgets are, what scaling is, etc. And being able to look at threat and vulnerability management within one tool set. Microsoft gives us the ability to not only use their tool set that's built into the Defender for endpoint stack, but also we can tap into a known leader in that threat and vulnerability management space through Qualsys to be able to look at vulnerabilities as they occur, whether that's through outdated software that lives in our environment, whether that's through vulnerabilities with Windows, etc. We then have one pane of glass to be able to see those. And even take a step further outside of security, more and more compliance is a big story, and being able to ensure that you're meeting your industry required compliances within your data center as well. And at the end of the day, we have all this data, we're then able to take and automate how we respond to different activities, being able to use things like event hubs and log analytics, logic apps to help make our lives easier, and we can work smarter, not harder. I will pause there for a second, see if everyone, now we can see where the journey is taking us from that traditional multi-tool set approach that we see in IT to a single tool set. Where are we going now to be able to jumpstart using some of those tools? Give me an opportunity to get a drink of water as well. So questions that we hear with our customers, where do I go next? Where they're wanting to eliminate complexities. They want to do that streamline and strengthening story by looking at security posture, but also help them from a management perspective by modernizing not only how they look at their inventory, how they look at vulnerabilities, how they conquer compliance, how they improve automation without spending a fortune or even spending less than what they're doing today. Some of the questions that come to mind when we have these conversations is what technology stacks do I need to consider? And what technology tools do I need to implement? And then from a process perspective, what do I need to change in my IT organization? So let's tackle the first one. Let's talk about the technology stacks. Oh, hello. As we look within our technology stacks, here are a number of the components as we talk to customers that we see administrators having to wrap their arms around: where their data centers are, what servers they have, what devices they may have, where is their data stored, what does their network look like, how is that data coming through, and how do they respond? Hello? Heard someone speak up. Do you have a question or? None? All right. So as we look at all of those different tool sets, all of those different technologies, we have definitely moved away from that concept of a flat network. Most of us, as I mentioned on the beginning of my call, Shari mentioned, we're all working remotely. We're not in physical offices. We're traveling. We have multiple devices. So gone are those days of that simplified network where everything is behind a firewall. Everything now kind of looks like this. It's more modern. We have so many different technologies that we're utilizing, that we're managing. We've got a lot of devices. We're using identities that we control, as well as tapping into SaaS applications where we're extending our resource, our identity stacks into SaaS applications. We also have applications that are managed and unmanaged. Some are sanctioned and unsanctioned. As we look at the network that we manage today, these are all the different components that come into play that we have as IT organizations that we need to protect. And so as we look at all of those different stacks, now we start to look at the technology tools. This is where, as part of that streamlining and strengthening story, we want to be able to leverage tools like Defender for Cloud to be able to strengthen our posture, but also being able to use Azure Arc to provide that hybrid management capabilities from a multitude of different workloads. So as we look at how we're going to manage those tools, moving away from your traditional tool sets like SCCM or third-party tools, Azure Arc really is that management tool to help us automate. And there's multiple flavors of Arc. There's Arc for servers, Kubernetes being able to manage containers at scale, data services being able to manage our databases, our data lakes, data warehouses. This will allow us to automate those tools, and Microsoft has given us the ability to quickly onboard resources in Azure, but through extending those resources to our servers that are on-premise, we have a number of different tools that we need to implement in and on our servers to be able to not only connect for orchestration through Azure Arc, be able to connect our log data through the Microsoft Management Agent, our monitoring agent, and then the Defender for Endpoint for being able to provide antivirus protection, as well as threat and vulnerability management. These are the tool sets that we're replacing existing agents that might live on our servers. Common ones that we see with customers: Rapid7, CrowdStrike, Carbon Black. Those are a few that these tools will end up replacing and can be automated through the onboarding of Azure Arc. So looking at how we onboard our resources, we have ease of doing that for not only our on-prem data centers, which we'll talk about here in a moment, but also our Azure resources as well. Another big story that customers ask, well, if I'm moving all of my management into the cloud, sure, I've got great visibility into threats and vulnerabilities, but how do I keep my servers up to date? How do I avoid a lot of those weekends or weeknights that we're rebooting servers and making sure services come back up, etc. That we can automate as well through Azure Arc. So instead of having to utilize tools like SCCM, the Azure Arc agent will help manage those quote unquote update rings for your server resources through deployment groups. Plus, being able to leverage Azure policies, which would be the same as your on-premises group policies, we can then take Microsoft best practices to provide protection and improve our security posture and our network security by using some of those policies. Microsoft has some great built-in templates that you can leverage, or you can build your own. Now, I've got a number of customers that will use Azure and Microsoft as kind of a springboard, but then they'll go in and based on their security requirements will harden their environment even further. And Microsoft has some templates for those as well. Being able to not only manage our server postures or policies on servers, but also being able to monitor any sort of changes that occur on those servers, as well as something that we are able to leverage with desired state configuration too. So here, as you can see, is an example of when updates have run, if there's been any changes to the registry, if there's any services that have made changes. It's really actually impressive to see from a desired state configuration perspective how many of those Windows services are constantly making changes, such as the Defender agents and others that run on your servers as well. Any little change that happens at the file server level, the registry, or by services is all tracked here through that desired state config inside of Azure Arc. And then being able to not only look at our configurations, but also our security. Those are capabilities that when we onboard Azure Arc, we have that ability from an integration perspective to not only deploy the agent to the cloud, but also being able to onboard the threat and vulnerability management tool set that is native to that Defender for Endpoint stack. And some of you that are currently using the E5 and are protecting your endpoints through Defender for Endpoint, you're able to see some of the security recommendations here in that single pane of glass, not only for your workstations, but also for your servers too. And we have the ability, for free, you can actually move between what Microsoft's built-in threat and vulnerability management is, or if you want to integrate Qualsys, if you're a current Qualsys customer, you can perform that integration too. So we talked about our Azure Arc and some of its capabilities of being able to perform management. How do we then now extend our security footprint? How do we leverage some of those same tools that we're familiar with in the endpoint world as well in the cloud, and using that Microsoft Defender story? We'll talk about how that comprehensive protection looks across your entire network, across your data centers, across your endpoints. These are a number of tool sets that Microsoft, through the Defender for Cloud, are able to layer on top of that and be able to provide those levels of protection. And we have that centralized Defender dashboard where we can look at different alerts. We could look at threats that come through. This is just one option of being able to leverage one dashboard. We'll talk a little bit about some of the other capabilities here in a little bit as we talk about logging, monitoring, reporting, and what are the options, not only within this particular tool, but then how we could use tools like Azure Monitor or Azure Sentinel to extend those capabilities even further. The core of a lot of the protection that we traditionally see in our data centers really does sit on our servers and being able to protect those servers just in time, but not only protecting them as they live in our Azure data centers, but also living on-prem, whether it's Windows, whether it's Linux. Microsoft has that protection capability and leverages Defender, not the exact same way that we would use Defender to manage our endpoints. We can use that same tool set as well, to look at EDR capabilities for our servers as well, to be able to protect from lateral movement, to be able to look at behavior analysis, to be able to use that same anti-malware engine, as well as being able to leverage things like Defender for cloud apps and sanctioned and unsanctioned apps. We can build out those blocked and allowed lists for applications as well. We can use Defender for SQL to protect the SQL data footprint, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's on-prem. We can protect all of our different data resources, as well as being able to provide protection to our storage, not even necessarily data that's in our databases, but data that lives in flat files, that lives in blobs, that lives in data shares. Microsoft makes it extremely easy to, within the Defender for Cloud portal, to just turn on a single option to be able to start monitoring for protection, and then as needed, if there's any sort of vulnerability that's detected, if the attacker is trying to perform some sort of malicious activity against storage, we then see those alerts are able to flow not only to our admins, but also be able to go into SecOps. And that leads into things like Azure Sentinel, being able to remediate and respond, whether that's automatically using AI or if that is done manually by way of an administrator. And so protecting not only our databases is important, protecting our flat files are important, but also our containers. As more and more organizations are moving to containerization for deploying applications, etc., we can then use Defender for containers as well to be able to look at those registries, be able to look at images, make sure that there are no vulnerabilities in those images, but also being able to scan those real time as well. And then extending that container protection as well through Defender for Kubernetes, and being able to protect not only our clusters, but also being able to run that real-time protection to see if there's any sort of suspicious workloads that may be happening in those containers, being able to look at the logging, being able to look at detection, and being able to flow that data into that single pane of glass as well with the Defender dashboard. And through those resources, we then are now protecting our data, our servers, and taking it to a step further, we can use that Defender for Cloud story to look at our resources that are in Azure. We can look at DNS as we see more and more customers that are moving their domain named DNS zones into Azure. Microsoft's providing some visibility and monitoring to those zones for DNS to see if there's any sort of suspicious activities or queries, as well as being able to protect our secrets through the Azure Key Vault and providing that capabilities. So we cover a lot of our data center footprint. We cover a lot of our cloud footprint. And now, as we start to see more and more organizations move to IoT, we can use Defender there as well to be able to look at our IoT inventory, see if there's any vulnerabilities the same way we did with our Windows servers or our workstations, being able to detect threats, and then being able to take action with that, whether that's using that manually or shipping that data into Sentinel, which is that preferred security and event management platform for Microsoft to be able to tie all of these resources together. Pause there for a second, make sure everyone's still here. See if there's any questions so far.
Yeah. Yes, we are. Yeah, there is. Michael had posted that, that he is concerned about the old, like out of support versions of Office running on servers. Mm-hmm. How can this help me report on and remediate those servers? I think it was a while ago, so you might have to, yeah.
Sure. And actually, as we talk about that story of threat and vulnerability management, and let's see if we back up a few slides. Here we go. So as we look at threat and vulnerability management, using those same engines and those same tool sets that we would on our Windows devices to see if we've got outdated versions of applications, if we see there's out of support versions of applications, that would be an example of what Microsoft calls EOS, or end of support for those applications. Flash is a very popular one that we see, older versions of Java, but Office too. We can actually see over here, if you look on the right side of the screen within the security recommendations, this is where Microsoft is going to provide those recommendations. And there's actually a lot of attack surface reduction capabilities and protections that we can extend to our servers too, to protect in those instances of still needing to run old versions of applications, or even just to be able to report on, hey, those are still in the wild. What's our next steps to be able to replace those dependent applications, or at least to be able to isolate those servers that might be running critical business functions, and knowing where they are and where they live. So hopefully that answers your question. This is a very typical exercise when it comes to being able to look at old and outdated software in the environment, being able to report on this very easily. We can do by way of some of the security recommendations within the Microsoft server, or the Microsoft security portal is probably the number one place to be able to look at that across the environment, not even just necessarily on servers. Thanks for asking that, Michael. So talked about the breadth of what the Defender for Cloud toolset can do, from protecting all of our different resources. As we start to now think about, okay, I know what is the art of the possible. I know what I can protect. How do I implement that? So looking at licensing, that's a big thing for the Defender for Cloud. The nice thing about it is, if you haven't tested it out yet, you can turn it on for any of your Azure subscriptions, and you get 30 days of a free trial. And so then once you start to then determine what tools you want to enable, that's where you can then start to turn on some of those different tool sets. For example, as we start to look at Defender for servers and how we want to provide some of that visibility and protection, as you can see, Microsoft does have two different tiers that they provide protection across. There's a very lightweight tier that just provides the AV and EDR and threat and vulnerability management capabilities. But then there's also the plan 2 that takes it a step further by being able to look at network layer detection, just-in-time access, being able to have adaptive app controls and file integrity monitoring, looking at additional network hardening, and allows you to contribute some of that log analytics storage needs that you will usually see come off of these servers. Once you start to enable the monitoring agent, you get some concessions by way of storage there as well. So turning on is very easy. As you go into the Azure portal, you go into Defender for Cloud, you can then start to see all of your different subscriptions. You can then see the number of different plans and the protection for being able to turn those on. And then being able to understand a little bit more around some of the data collection notifications when some of these resources are turned on, etc. I provided some of these resources that I'm more than happy to have you dig into a little bit more after this presentation. For anyone that's interested, you can kind of see what some of those best practices are for turning on those resources and monitoring. When it comes to resource onboarding, automated is recommended. As we look to onboard those non-Azure resources, our data centers, our servers, ones that we're still building within our environment, physical servers, this is where we can extend that management capability for those as well. Some of that we can do automated inside of Azure, which makes our lives easier as we're spinning up IaaS resources in the Azure cloud. But we can extend those same capabilities on premises as well. If we don't use some of that automation and we start to look at deploying those manually, there are a number of different components. A lot of this does run on log analytics, that data that we pull from those agents to be able to look at any sort of system changes, any sort of security risks or threats. All that is stored in log analytics, where we could use KQL to easily look at some of that server data. So at the heart and soul of these tool sets, it is reliant on that log data that we're able to pull from those servers. Now, looking at, as we mentioned, onboarding servers automatically in the Azure cloud, just by way of a few check marks, we can easily start to onboard those resources, those VMs, automatically have those onboarded into Azure Arc, which is great, being able to have that threat and vulnerability management turned on by default. But then how do we onboard those servers that live on-prem? So there's a couple of different ways to do that. One of them would be if you're using the Windows Admin Center that are the Windows Server Administrator that's now part of Server 2019, you can actually connect your Azure Arc resources into that Windows Server Administrator. So then as you're building your servers in your traditional data centers, you're still onboarding Windows servers, it has that ability to see that server come online and being able to onboard it to Arc, be able to push that Microsoft Monitor agent for being able to pull that data into log analytics, and makes that automated onboarding a lot easier. I do still have customers that they're not fully utilizing things like the Windows Server Administrator, and as they go through and they build a server, one of the things they will typically do is just run a script to onboard a server into Azure Arc, which is something you can do as well by setting up an SPN in Azure, by being able to set up that service principal and getting those secrets. I've actually created a script that you can find out on my GitHub that you can run on your servers to allow you to onboard those as part of the build process for any servers that you may deploy on-prem. Again, highly recommend using that Windows Server Administrator to onboard your servers into Arc, but there is the capability if you wanted to add non-Azure machines in bulk, just by way of a script, that is something that you can easily do as well. Once you onboard those servers into the cloud, as I mentioned, we will define a log analytics workspace for that data to be collected in. And by default, whenever you create a workspace, each subscription is going to have an area that it will retain that data. If we want to centralize all of those subscriptions and all of that data into one workspace, you do have the option to configure that as part of that extension deployment as well. So we talked about Windows servers, we talked about Azure and non-Azure services. Microsoft also allows us to, within that single pane of glass of the Defender for Cloud dashboard, also onboard servers into AWS. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. There are resources that help you onboard those AWS services into the Azure cloud and the Defender for Cloud, being able to then onboard some of your EC2 instances to Arc as well as to Azure cloud. We've got those things there as well. We also have the ability to connect and deploy the Azure Arc into those log analytics workspaces for those servers as they may live in your data center, whether they're Linux servers. We want to make sure that you onboard those as well, and being able to have some of those VM management extensions deployed to those servers as well as they live in that AWS cloud. Whether they're in your cloud or at Azure, or they're in the Amazon cloud, Microsoft does have that ability to support those Linux servers as well. Plus, we can actually extend the Defender for Cloud Management into the Google cloud as well. So I've got some resources as well for being able to integrate into their security and command capabilities as well. And so, again, onboarding those are very similar. We deploy the agents for Azure Arc to those machines. We're then able to see those into the Azure Arc and the Defender for Cloud dashboards. We then can start to see those log analytics data start to come in, as well as being able to deploy those threat and vulnerability management solutions to those as well. So not only are we able to have visibility into our data center clouds that might be on-prem, our private clouds, the Microsoft cloud, but then any VMs that we may have inside of the Amazon cloud or the Google cloud, we now have that single pane of glass to be able to see those as well. So taking that a step further, now we've onboarded our servers for automation. How do we onboard our servers and provide protection to those as well? If we were to do that manually, again, as I mentioned, a lot of that data that Microsoft uses for threat and vulnerability management, for endpoint protection, is all housed within Log Analytics. And as we look at some of those older server builds, even though we start to see less and less of 2008 R2, though it's still in the wild, and we see some server 2012, we do have that ability to onboard those servers as well, just by way of downloading that Windows agent manually inside of the Log Analytics portal within your Log Analytics workspace. By installing that agent on there, it's then able to see that threat and vulnerability management. To take that a step further, for server 2012 R2 and 2016 and more of that modern approach, Microsoft does have an updated version of the client that provides a lot more capabilities in being able to isolate servers, do remote EDR management, etc. Similar to what we would see with our server 2019 versions and more of that modern build. We have that visibility through the Defender for Endpoint agent to provide that protection capabilities, as well as to Defender for Endpoint and onboarding that as well. And then once we have our servers onboarded, again, keeping in mind that this is for Windows servers, we have the ability to be able to go into the Defender for Cloud portal, to go into the Microsoft Security portal, and being able to test and validate that a threat, any active threat, is not only detected but also reported up to that portal as well. As we see some customers, as I mentioned, Microsoft's threat and vulnerability management capabilities have a lot of power behind them, but we do still have customers that also will utilize, a third party. So being able to integrate some of those solutions, Microsoft has a script up inside of Azure that you run to install that vulnerability assessment. To take that a next step further, we can then also we can onboard things like Qualsys and being able to onboard those as well. So then that way, if we want to do any sort of remediation with that as a third-party tool, we can deploy that inside of our environment as well. Same thing goes for turning on outside of our server resources. We go to turn on protection for some of our data resources. We then have the ability to turn on the Defender for SQL, and Microsoft gives us visibility into what type of resources it supports, as well as what some of those costs may look like, that you would actually find inside of the Defender for Cloud portal as well. Same place you would find all the information on your subscriptions for those particular, the Defender for Cloud resources for that particular subscription. And then we can then extend that threat and vulnerability management capabilities to be able to do vulnerability assessments against not only our SQL servers, but then also being able to look at our managed SQL instances, being able to look for any unhealthy resources and being able to remediate those as well. And there's a couple of extra caveats here. I'm not going to go too far into the details for being able to do any sort of validation for monitoring some of those resources, but wanted to provide some of those technology tips when it comes to turning it on for the SQL resources in Azure as well. Not only those hosted resources that are in Azure, Microsoft also lets you do the SQL Defender on actual SQL servers as well. Again, being able to manage some of those, deploy some of those capabilities through Azure Arc is going to be the easiest way to be able to have those capabilities. And then as we take that a step further, we can then go in and turn on that enablement for Defender for storage. And then it starts to be able to monitor some of those blobs. It's then looking at some of the threat intelligence data from Microsoft, and then we can start to send some of that data out to monitoring resources as well. So we've seen the capabilities of how we can enable our resources to be able to look at and monitor and protect our cloud resources, our third-party clouds, our servers, our storage. Now, how do we go through and validate that? And then how do we operationalize? So this next step before we go through and really start to build out our operationalization for managing our resources in the cloud, we can go through and look at not only the Microsoft monitoring agent inside of our log analytics workspace, but also being able to go and look at our Defender for Cloud status as well. I provided some additional resources here for being able to provide validation for the Azure Arc resources, being able to look at the Defender for Cloud Asset inventory, some troubleshooting guides, and looking at that connected machine agent that Azure Arc utilizes to be able to run. And provided some of those validation resources that once you've onboarded servers, if you need to do any additional troubleshooting, you've got those resources here as well as being able to look at how you would monitor those resources and their status to ensure that they are healthy. Same thing for Defender for Endpoint, being able to look at their status. We can look at that not only in Defender for Cloud, but again, as I mentioned with that detection script, we can look at that data also in the Microsoft security portal as well. So we've covered a lot of ground. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, this is it's a lot to unpack. There's a lot that goes into really thinking about our clouds, being able to think about the resources, onboarding those resources. That's traditionally the tip of the iceberg, even though 75 slides later, that's a big tip of an iceberg for onboarding those resources. But then the other half of the conversation that we're having with customers, that we're having with their security teams, is how do we operationalize that? How do we take the logging, monitoring, and reporting capabilities that are within these resources and really make use of them? Behind the scenes, a lot of it is powered, like I mentioned, not only from log analytics, but also powered by Azure Monitor, but being able to look at the data across all of these resources, being able to look at insights, being able to drill into the monitoring data, being able to really scale up our resources, being able to visualize those in dashboard and collect data. There's a lot of capabilities that are at our fingertips within Azure Monitor that will look at a lot of that data that comes through the log analytics workspace. And to take that data even further, we can start to leverage some of the workbooks, some of the Power BI dashboards that Microsoft makes available natively to build out our own SecOps dashboards, our own IT operations dashboards, and then being able to look at some of the workbooks to be able to quickly look at the different resources and the data that's being fed in from all of the different Defender for Cloud resources, Azure Arc. This is how we could then visualize some of those natively without any additional cost beyond what we are utilizing within our Defender subscriptions, being able to then take that and create alerts, being able to take and build out our own custom KQL queries, where if we see any sort of delineation from normal configuration behavior, we can then be alerted for those capabilities as well. So Azure Monitor is one means of being able to have that visibility. Obviously, from a security perspective, the Cadillac, as I like to put it, if we are starting to look at monitoring and management of all of these resources in the Microsoft Cloud and all of our other Microsoft resources, Sentinel is the best approach, being able to have that security and event management in one place as we talk about all of our clouds, all of our security resources, all of our data resources. Sentinel is the best way to be able to bring all of that threat detection and response and utilize AI to help us work smarter and not harder. It does it by way of a multitude of different connectors. I remember, I think it was 3 years ago, right as Sentinel was starting to come out, there was probably 23, and now there's 100 more connectors to a multitude of different cloud platforms. Not even Microsoft, but also being able to tie into a multitude of other different providers that you may still have on-prem or even SaaS applications, etc. We can integrate those operationally into Azure Sentinel to be able to have visibility. And as part of having M365 there are some log file types that Microsoft will allow you to collect and actually be able to report on for free, just by way of having those subscriptions. Same way with your Defender for Cloud and your Azure Arc. By having those subscriptions, you're able to tap into that data and be able to centralize it all into this one place. And we're then able to extend what Microsoft considers analytic rules to be able to look at certain behaviors in each of those different technologies. And if it sees any sort of abnormalities, we have an ability to create an incident. From those incidents, we have the ability to get email notifications. We could do Azure automation. We could do any sort of logic apps to automate a lot of that responsiveness. So we're then allowing AI to let us work smarter and not harder. And then here's an example of some of the powerful capabilities where we can extend log analytics to be able to build out queries and report on certain activities that may happen within log analytics. So then we're monitoring data that may come in from a Google Cloud, from our servers, from M365. We're able to cross-reference all that data and all the different tables that exist in log analytics to be able to have a custom rule and being able to provide some of that reporting capabilities. We can also then extend that further with automation playbooks. I've got a number of customers that are leveraging those log analytics tables from all these different resources and then being able to build out some of their own automation and some of their own reporting as well. And the community. I can't say enough about, the reason that we've seen, at least I've seen Azure Sentinel really start to take off over the last couple of years is not only the Microsoft community, but also a lot of the Microsoft professionals and those in the community that as they've seen different types of detection needs required and they built out some pretty complex KQL queries, we're starting to see those available very easily through the Azure Sentinel portal. So we can then leverage some of the work the community has done to help us work smarter, not harder. As well, Microsoft is helping us with hunting queries where we can take and we can look at different resources across different data sources, as you can see here over in the right-hand side. All of these are tables within log analytics that we're then able to look across and look for any sort of activities. Microsoft has this advanced hunting as well. If you're familiar with the security portal, security.microsoft.com, they have some of those capabilities in there as well with some hunting queries. So now that we've painted this picture of server management and cloud management and being able to streamline and strengthen and use a single tool set, this at the end is really how we want our customers and how we want to challenge each of you to look at how you're approaching security, how you're approaching management, where you can eliminate tool sets and being able to work smarter, not harder, by taking and pulling all of this into one single tool set. We've seen a lot of our customers that have started to go down this road and start to eliminate a lot of different tool sets, be able to retool where some of their IT teams are working to where then they can start to build out more automation and more detection capabilities and being able to do more with less. Any questions? I am looking in the chat. Oh, good friend Robert Madej. How you doing, Robert? So training around Sentinel on a day-to-day. So there's a couple of resources. Rod Trent, he is, I forget what his actual title is, but he is a, one of a Microsoft employee that kind of does a lot of training within the community. He's a great resource. I'll see if I can find his blog real quick. I will post that in the chat, but I usually follow him on LinkedIn and he provides a lot of great resources around how to really operationalize the use of Sentinel. Let's see, I'm going to drop his LinkedIn here in the chat. He's a cloud security advocate at Microsoft. So he's a great resource to be able to kind of follow and look at some of the blogs. He does a lot of, helps build a lot of the material within the community around Azure Sentinel. Thanks for that question. Again, I'll go ahead and I'll add his information here to the resources tab. So you can feel free to reference that at any time. And again, I'll get this presentation over to Michelle and the rest of the team, so then that way she can get that shared out with everyone in the community, and you can take a look at some of these resources at your leisure. With that, Michelle, I'll hand it over to you.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much. That was such a thorough job, and I can't wait to get the deck. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and everyone will be sure to post it back on our website as we normally do. We have all of these being recorded, and then we post a recording to YouTube, and then back on the event page. If there's any material like presentations like Chris's, we'll go ahead and post them, and we'll get Shari's as well and post them on that event page. But I thought I'd check to see if there's any learning paths that are for Azure Sentinel. And I know, Robert, you were asking. I'm going to go ahead and throw that in the chat. These are from our December 2020 posting on learning Azure Sentinel on Microsoft Learn. So if anyone is interested in getting a little bit more information, I know that certainly helps me as I'm going and learning about a new tool.
And Leaf asked a great question. Is Azure Arc a service or something that has to be set up in IaaS? It is a service. So it operates similarly to Sentinel. It operates similarly to Defender for Cloud. It is really the automation arm of being able to extend resources into your different clouds. So a lot of it being able to automate management around SQL resources, Kubernetes, Windows servers, all those are ones that live inside of Azure Arc. And I'll actually show you real quick. Since we do have a couple of extra minutes here, let me pull up. I'll go back over here and I'll show you. Here is my Azure Arc workspace. So as you can see, if I wanted to look at all of the resources that I have onboarded, again, I just have a couple of servers here, but I could connect into Azure Stack. In preview right now, I can even connect Azure Arc into VMware. So that way I can, as I go to automate my server builds, I can tap that into my hypervisor to be able to make that automation easier and smoother as well. And as you can see here, application management, resources, data services, there's a lot of capabilities when it comes to Azure Arc and being able to manage all of your resources. And that's really where Microsoft introduced this as a product to give you a single pane of glass for management versus having to have multiple different places to provision a server, to manage a server, to patch a server, to configure a server, moving away from that traditional SCCM environment and pulling this all into the cloud where you have all of your additional cloud resources as well.